Chapter 7. Profit, Average Profit, and the Law of the Tendency of the Rate of Profit to Fall. In Chapters 7 through 10, we will deal with themes from the third volume of Capital. With this volume, we encounter those categories that express the empirical reality of capitalist relations, meaning the way the capitalist mode of production appears to our immediate perception. Marx characterizes the continuity of the three volumes of Capital in the following way at the beginning of the third volume. Quote, "In Volume 1, we investigated the phenomenon exhibited by the process of capitalist production taken by itself, i.e. the immediate production process, in which connection all secondary influences external to this process were left out of account. But this immediate production process does not exhaust the life cycle of capital. In the world as it actually is, it is supplemented by the process of circulation. And this formed our object of investigation in the second volume. Here we showed, particularly in Part 3, where we considered the circulation process as it mediates the process of social reproduction, that the capitalist production process, taken as a whole, is a unity of the production and circulation processes. It cannot be the purpose of the present third volume simply to make general reflections on this unity. Our concern is rather to discover and present the concrete forms which grow out of the process of capitalist movement considered as a whole. In their actual movement, capitals confront one another in certain concrete forms, and in relation to these, both the shape capital assumes in the immediate production process and its shape in the process of circulation appear merely as particular moments. The configuration of capital as developed in this volume thus approach step by step the form in which they appear on the surface of society, and the action of different capitals on one another, i.e. in competition and in the everyday consciousness of the agents of production themselves." End quote. Capital, Volume 3, page 117. Coffee break. Section 1. Cost price, profit, and the rate of profit. Categories and everyday mystifications. The value of every capitalistically produced commodity can be depicted as constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value, where constant capital denotes the value of the means of production used, and the variable capital and surplus value denote the value newly created in the expenditure of living labor. For the capitalist, constant capital and variable capital is the essential quantity. It indicates that what the commodity costs the capitalist. Marx refers to this quantity as the cost price of the commodity, the constant capital and variable capital combined. As far as the creation of the commodity's value is concerned, constant capital and variable capital play completely different roles. The value of the means of production used is transferred to the product, while the value of labor power has nothing to do with the value of the product, since a new value based upon the expenditure of labor power is transferred to the product. Mathematically, this new value is equal to variable capital plus surplus value. However, the different roles played by constant capital and variable capital in the creation of value are not immediately apparent. To wit, in the form of the wage, all labor appears to be paid labor. With variable capital, labor's contribution of value to the finished product seems to be compensated, just as the case of constant capital, the value contributed by the means of production is to be paid. A difference between both components of capital is not apparent. The sole difference noticeable to the capitalist is that between fixed and circulating capital, even though the difference between fixed and circulating capital has nothing to do with the creation of value, but rather with the time of the return of value. Surplus value is initially just a surplus of the commodity's value above the commodity's cost price, which is to say above the value spent on its production. The capitalist is aware that this surplus has its origin in the productive procedures that occur with his capital. However, since the capitalist perceives no difference with regard to the creation of value between the contribution of individual capital portions, this surplus seems to emanate from all portions of capital equally, from constant and variable capital just as much as from fixed and circulating capital. Surplus value, as the fruit of the total capital advanced, is profit. In the case of profit, the same quantity is set in relation to the value of the total capital advanced rather than just the value of labor power. But profit is not just another word for surplus value. It is important to note that profit is linked to a completely different notion, one that mystifies actual conditions. Surplus value is the surplus of new value created by living labor, above the value of labor power. The expenditure of living labor is under capitalist conditions the source of surplus value. Profit, on the other hand, is the surplus of the commodity's value, above the portion of capital advanced that is used in the commodity's production. Here, capital appears as the cause of profit. Marx summarizes the difference between surplus value and profit as follows. Quote, in surplus value, the relationship between capital and labor is laid bare. In the relationship between capital and profit, i.e. between capital and surplus value, as it appears on the one hand as an excess over the cost price of commodity realized in the circulation process, and on the other hand as an excess determined more precisely by its relationship to total capital, capital appears as a relationship to itself, a relationship which it is distinguished as an original sum of value from another new value that it posits. It is in consciousness that capital generates this new value in the course of its movement through the production and circulation process. But how this happens is now mystified and seems to derive from hidden qualities that are inherent in capital itself. End quote. Capital Volume 3, page 139. Profit's mystification of actual relations has another mystification as a presupposition, namely the conception of the wage as the payment of labor. Only because the wage is not viewed as payment of the value of labor power, but rather as the payment of the value of labor, can surplus value appear as profit, that is, as the fruit of capital. Surplus value in the form of profit is not just a conception that mystifies actual relations. This conception is of practical relevance, since the individual capitalist is only interested in profit as a surplus of the commodity's value above the value of capital required for its production. Thus, the measure of valorization for the capitalist is not the rate of surplus value over variable capital, but rather the rate of profit, surplus value over the cost price, or in other words, surplus value over constant capital and variable capital. Every time capital is advanced, the capitalist has an interest in the highest possible rate of profit. This quantity is decisive for the practical activity of the capitalist. The rate of profit can be raised under otherwise constant conditions by an increase in the rate of surplus value. But the rate of profit can also be increased under a constant and even falling rate of surplus value. Fundamentally, there are three possibilities. 1. Economy in the use of constant capital. The elements of constant capital are dealt with sparingly. Such savings can arise from an extension of the volume of production. Production that is increased twofold does not necessarily require a double amount of energy, buildings, etc. This is especially the case when the extension of production is achieved through an extension of the workday. In a two-shift workplace, one can produce twice as much with the same machines and buildings as in a one-shift workplace. Only the raw materials have to be doubled. At a constant rate of surplus value and variable capital double, but the constant capital increases by far less, so that the rate of profit increases enormously. Hence, the capitalist can afford to pay overtime and night shift bonuses. Due to this, the rate of surplus value decreases slightly, but on the basis of the enormous savings of constant capital, the rate of profit nonetheless increases. As a constant volume of production, at a constant volume of production, savings in constant capital can be achieved by a more rational use of raw materials and energy, but also at the cost of the laborers if cutting back on safety measures or by accepting labor processes that are dangerous to workers' health. We already addressed the economization and the application of constant capital in section 3, chapter 5, but only as something that reduces the cost of the product. Now it is clear that this also increases the rate of profit. 2. Economization in the production of constant capital. If the value of the elements of constant capital decrease, then the value of constant capital also decreases, without necessitating any change in the concrete method of production. The increase in the rate of profit in one sphere is thus a result of an increase in the productivity in another sphere. 3. Acceleration of the turnover of capital. If an individual capital turns over twice in a year, then twice as much surplus value is produced than is in the case of the capital, which under otherwise identical conditions only turns over once in a year. The rate of profit of the first capital would thus be twice as high as that of the second. Acceleration in the turnover in capital increases the rate of profit. Section 2. Average profit and prices of production. One thing becomes obvious in light of the method described above for raising the rate of profit under an otherwise constant rate of surplus value. Two capitals that produce with the same rate of surplus value have different rates of profit if they exhibit a different composition of capital, constant capital divided by variable capital, at an otherwise equal turnover time, or if they exhibit different turnover times in the case of an otherwise equal composition of capital. For clarification's sake, let's use a numerical example. Assuming the rate of surplus value is a uniform 100%, while disregarding fixed capital, the two capitals A and B shall have the same turnover time of 1 year. For capital A, constant capital is equal to 90, and variable capital is equal to 10. For the other capital, capital B, constant capital is equal to 60, and variable capital is equal to 40. Then capital A should produce a surplus value of 10. Capital A's rate of profit amounts to 10 over 100, or 10%. Capital B produces a surplus value of 40. The rate of profit here amounts to 40 over 100, or equal to 40%. The unequal composition of capital leads to different rates of profit. The higher the composition of value, the lower the rate of profit. Now let's take a look at capital C, which has the same composition of value as capital A, but a turnover time is twice a year. Capital C's surplus value is therefore 2 times 10, or 20. And its rate of profit amounts to 20 divided by 90 plus 10, or 20 divided by 100, equal to 20%, where capital A only achieves a rate of profit of 10%. The shorter the turnover time, the higher is the annual rate of profit. However, the composition of value and the turnover time of capital cannot be arbitrarily selected by capitalists, but are bound by the concrete conditions within individual branches. In a steel mill, for example, considerably more constant capital in proportion to variable capital is employed than in the clothing industry. If commodities were sold at their values, that is, if the normal price of commodities were an adequate expression of the value of commodities, then there must be a completely different rate of profits among the individual branches. Even if the rate of surplus value, the exploitation of labor, is the same everywhere. The sole aim of capital is valorization. The sole interest of the owner of capital, insofar as he or she behaves like a capitalist, that is to say, as capital personified, consists in achieving the greatest possible valorization of his or her advanced capital. If different branches offer different rates of profit, then capitalists will try to pull their capital out of branches with low rates of profit and invest their capital in branches with higher rates of profit. If the movement of capital between branches is possible, and not, for example, impeded by legal restrictions, then more and more capital will flow into branches with high rates of profit and out of branches with lower rates of profit. This leads to the amount of available commodities increasing in branches with high rates of profit and decreasing in branches with low rates of profit. Due to the competition between capitalists, the increasing supply in the branches with initially high rates of profits will on the one hand lead to decreasing sale prices and ultimately declining profit rates, whereas on the other hand the declining supply in the branches with initially low rates of profit leads to a rise in prices and ultimately increasing rates of profit. The different rates of profit equalize into an average or general rate of profit. The average profit attained by an individual capital is equal to the cost price of a commodity, the cost of means of production and wages per commodity unit, multiplied by the average rate of profit. The prices of production result from the sum of the cost price and the average rate of profit. If the disbursement for means of production amounts to 100 euros, for wages 20 euros, and if the average rate of profit is 10%, then the cost price of the commodity is 120 euros, the average profit 12 euros, and the production price is 1.3 to 100, Let me just read that last sentence. If the disbursement for means of production amount to 100 euros, for wages 200... Jesus Christ. Relax, buddy. You're going to get through this. If the disbursement for means of production amount to 100 euros, for wages 20 euros, and if the average rate of profit is 10%, then the cost price of the commodity is 120 euros. The average profit 12 euros, and the production price is 132 euros. To the individual capitalist, this average profit appears to be a premium added to the cost price. For the individual capitalist, the level of his individual profit appears to depend on two quantities: the sales price set by the market, that is, the price at which he can sell the commodity, and the level of the cost price. If the individual capitalist can keep the cost price down, such as though the increased use of machinery, if the individual capitalist can keep the cost price down, such as through the increased use of machinery and the decreased use of labor power, then he can add more than the average profit to the price, thus obtaining an extra profit, and still sell the commodity at the commodity's market price. The actual profit of an individual capital, which can deviate from the average profit, thus seems on the one hand to depend on objective conditions, market prices, and on the other hand upon the subjective skill of the capitalist in producing at a low cost of production. The fact that profit rests upon the appropriation of surplus labor is not apparent. Quite the contrary. If the individual capitalist manages to produce with a decreased amount of labor, then usually his profit will increase. But in fact, average profit is also dependent upon surplus value, not the surplus value of the individual unit of capital, but rather from the surplus value produced in the economy as a whole. That is, from the surplus value of the total social capital. The equalization of rates of profit to a general rate of profit means nothing other than a redistribution of the total social surplus value. If commodities were to exchange at their values, then every capitalist would receive the surplus value produced with the help of his individual capital, and the profit rates of various capitalists would diverge widely. If commodities are exchanged according to prices of production, then every capitalist obtains a profit that on average is proportional to the magnitude of capital he has advanced, meaning that each capital receives on average, the same rate of profit. The capitalists have behaved towards the average rate of profit like shareholders in a corporation. The proportional profit is the same for everyone. Each shareholder obtains a share of the business's profits proportionate to the magnitude of his investment. In the third volume of Capital, Marx sketched out a simple quantitative method of calculation to arrive from a system of value, meaning that for the various branches, constant capital and variable capital and surplus value are givens and should be the same for all capitals within a branch, at a system of production prices. This method of calculation, however, has proven to be wrong. The fact that it contains an error was also noted by Marx, but he underestimated the effect of this error. The transformation problem, the question as to how and whether magnitudes of value can be transformed into production prices, was discussed intensively in the last century. But within the framework of a monetary theory of value, there can be no point to any sort of procedure for calculating production prices from values. Rather, quote, the transformation of values into prices of production, end quote, represents a conceptual advancement of the form determination of the commodity. One can only speak of an exchange of values as long as the sole determining moment of exchange is the relation of individually expended labor to the total labor of society. For the individually expended labor to constitute value, the three acts of reduction consummated in exchange must be given. The commodity in this case, that is, the commodity is dealt with in Chapter 3, is a capitalistically produced commodity, but the examination of the commodity abstracts from the existence of capital. The concepts thus gained, value, magnitude of value, money, etc., constitute the categorical premise necessary for the depiction of the production and circulation process of capital. But capital as dealt with in these analyses is still not capital as it exists in its empirical individual manifestations. Only after capital is depicted as the unity of production and circulation are we at the point where we can deal with the fundamental properties of empirically existing individual capitals. The transition from value and surplus value to production price and average profit is not a historical or even a temporal sequence, but rather a transition between different levels of description. At the level of value and surplus value, the capitalist socialization via exchange is conceived abstractly, and exchange is determined by the relationship of individually expended labor to the total labor of society. At the level of production price and average profit, exchange is determined by the relationship of an individual capital to the total social capital. Here it becomes manifest that exchange is not merely the socialization of commodity producers, but the socialization of capitalist commodity producers. Section 3. The law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. A critique. In the late 18th and in the 19th century, the notion that the average rate of profit in the developed capitalist countries has a tendency to fall was considered an indisputable empirical fact, although the reasons for the fall of the rate of profit were subject to dispute. There can be many different causes for a fall in the rate of profit. Rising wages, for example, or a rise in the price of raw materials. But those causes are of a rather coincidental and temporary nature. Wages can once again decline, and raw materials can become cheaper so that the rate of profit rises again. What Marx intended to show under the rubric of the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall was that independent of such temporary causes, there is a tendency for the rate of profit to fall, deriving from the nature of the capitalist mode of production itself, end quote. Capital Volume 3, page 319. That is, disregarding all particular circumstances, the general properties of capitalist development should bring about a tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Whether or not Marx managed to provide proof of this is a topic of heated debate. At the beginning of this chapter, it was pointed out that the rate of profit can be raised through the economization of constant capital or through the acceleration of capital turnover, but that the actual source of valorization is the exploitation of labor power. In Chapter 5, it was made clear that there are two fundamental possibilities for increasing the exploitation of labor power: lengthening of labor time, production of absolute surplus value, and reducing the value of labor power through an increase in the productivity of labor, production of relative surplus value. The lengthening of labor time is, however, only possible within limits. Thus, the typically capitalist method for increasing exploitation is the process of relative surplus value, and through the implementation of increasingly expensive machines at that. The constant revolution of production and the increasing displacement of human labor through the introduction of newer and more efficient machines. This is the picture given by the capitalist mode of production since the late 18th century. Such an accelerated development of the forces of production did not exist in any other mode of production preceding capitalism. In Section 2 of Chapter 5, it was shown that the individual capitalist introduced productivity increases in order to achieve an extra surplus value, or rather, as we can now say, an extra profit above the average profit. This extra profit disappears when the increase in productivity is generalized, when the value and the production price of the commodity respectively decrease. Insofar as the commodity enters into the consumption of working class households, then the value of labor power also decreases, so that as a result the rate of surplus value increases. Marx intends to prove that the average rate of profit falls due to this typically capitalist method of increasing productivity. As a result of the ceaseless drive for extra profit, not only should there be a decreased value or production price of the commodity as a result of the generalization of the new conditions of production, but also, behind the backs and against the wills of the individual capitalist, a decline in the average rate of profit. For Marx, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and capitalist development of the forces of production are two sides of the same coin. If Marx had been able to conclusively prove the connection, then he would have shown that a falling rate of profit belongs to the essence of capitalism. We will now take a detailed look at Marx's argumentation. If the average rate of profit falls, the individual rates of profit for all capital units do not necessarily have to fall. However, this must be the case for the most of the large industrial capitalists. If the falling rate of profit is in fact a typical tendency, then the falling rate of profit must demonstrate itself in the case of a typical individual capital. Marx's arguments refer to such a typical individual capital. Just as Marx did, we will remain in the following at the level of value. Just as Marx did, we will remain in the following at the level of value. Production prices entail additional complications. Disregarding fixed capital and assuming a constant turnover time of 1 year, the product thus has a value of constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value, and the rate of profit amounts to surplus value divided by constant capital and variable capital, or the cost price. As discussed in Chapter 5, as a consequence of increasing productivity via the implementation of machinery, the rate of surplus value, surplus divided by variable capital, increases, as does the value composition of capital, constant capital to variable capital. The quantitative development of these two magnitudes is derived from the movement of the rate of profit. If one divides the numerator and the denominator in the above formula for the rate of profit by variable capital, we are merely abbreviating the fraction by variable capital, thus not changing the numeric value of the fraction, then we obtain the following expression for the rate of profit. Now there's an equation here. I'm going to try to explain it real quick. Surplus value divided by constant capital and variable capital is equal to surplus value divided by variable capital divided by constant capital divided by variable capital plus variable capital divided by variable capital, which is equal to surplus value divided by variable capital divided by the constant capital divided by variable capital plus 1. Here the rate of surplus value and the value composition of capital are visible as determinants of the rate of profit. Marx bases his argument for the tendency of the rate of profit to fall upon a rise in the rise in value composition. Constant capital divided by variable capital. So if the rate of valorization, surplus value divided by variable or the rate of exploitation, were to remain constant, then the rise in the value composition would automatically lead to a decline in the rate of profit. The numerator of our fraction remains constant, the denominator increases, and thus the value of the fraction decreases. However, Marx claims that the rate of profit also falls in the case of an increasing rate of surplus value. If both the rate of surplus value and the value composition of capital increase, then the profit rate only falls if the value composition plus 1, the denominator of our fraction, increases faster than the rate of surplus value, the numerator. In order to prove that the rate of profit necessarily falls, it is not sufficient to prove that the value composition increases. One must also show that value composition increases by a certain degree, that the condition just named is fulfilled. And here lies the fundamental difficulty for every proof of the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. A general statement about the degree of increase for value composition is not possible. In one case, a specific increase in productivity can be achieved through a smaller quantity of additional constant capital. Value composition thus increases only a little bit, which can lead to the rate of profit rising, not falling, as a result of the increasing rate of surplus value. In another case, the same proportional increase in productivity may require a large amount of additional constant capital. Value composition thus increases strongly, and the rate of profit eventually declines. Marx also does not attempt to directly prove that value composition always rises to such a degree that the rate of profit falls. Instead, he starts with the amount of surplus value, the mass of surplus value. The total surplus value of a capital results from the average per capita surplus value multiplied by the number of workers, where the average per capita surplus value is equal to the rate of surplus value multiplied by the average per capita wage. Thus, for the total surplus value, another equation here, the total surplus value equals the rate of surplus value multiplied by the average wage per capita multiplied by the number of workers. If the number of workers declines, then the surplus value produced is reduced. But if the rate of surplus value increases at the same time, then the decline in the number of workers can be compensated for, and the same mass of surplus value is produced. This is only the case within certain limits. However, since the surplus value per capita cannot be arbitrarily large. This can be demonstrated using a simple example. If we assume that 24 workers perform 2 hours of surplus labor every day, then the total amount of surplus labor is 48 hours. But if the number of workers declines to 2, then these 2 workers are not able to perform 48 hours of surplus labor per day, regardless of how large the rate of surplus value is. This conclusion can be generalized. If the number of employees declines beyond a certain critical mass, then at some point the amount of surplus value produces also declines, regardless of how strong the rate of surplus value increases. Marx thought that he had sufficiently proved the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall using this consideration. But that was not the case. A declining mass of surplus value only indicates a fall in the rate of profit with certainty when the total capital, cost price of constant capital and variable capital required for the production of this surplus value has not also fallen, but it has at least remained the same. And Marx implicitly assumed this precondition in his example, but this assumption is not unproblematic. If, to say with our example, instead of 24 workers, only 2 are employed, then the amount of wages paid is correspondingly smaller. If the value of labor power remains constant, variable capital would be reduced to 1/12 of its previous value. But since the rate of surplus value increases enormously, the value of the labor power is also drastically reduced, and the 2 remaining workers would expend much less than 1/12 of the previous variable capital. For the total capital to remain the same, it is not sufficient for the constant capital to increase. Rather, it must increase by a certain amount. Namely, the constant capital must increase by the same amount that the variable capital has been reduced. Whether or not this is the profit fall cannot be answered at such a general level. We don't know whether the productivity increase has been implemented with a lot or a little additional constant capital. If constant capital does not increase strongly enough to compensate the reduction of variable capital, then the total capital advance declines. In this case, we have a declining mass of surplus value and declining capital. Whether the rate of profit falls depends upon what falls quicker, the mass of surplus value or the advanced capital. If the mass of surplus value falls quicker than the advanced capital, then the profit rate declines. If the advanced capital declines quicker than the surplus value, then the rate of profit increases despite the reduction in the mass of surplus value. In contrast to Marx, we cannot assume a law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. This does not mean that the rate of profit can't fall, which may very well be the case. However, the rate of profit can also rise. A long-lasting tendency for the rate of profit to fall cannot be substantiated at the general level of argumentation by Marx in Capital. Now the question is whether Marx's critique of political economy really loses anything without the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Many Marxists regard this law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall as the foundation of Marx's crisis theory, which is one reason why the debates were conducted with such vehemence. As we will see in Chapter 9, Marx's crisis theory does not require this law. For Marx, the law expressed something more general, namely, quote, that the capitalist mode of production comes up against a barrier to the development of the productive forces, which has nothing to do with the production of wealth as such, but this characteristic barrier in fact testifies to the restrictiveness and the solely historical and transitory character of the capitalist mode of production, end quote. Capital Volume 3, page 350. Even without this, the limitations of the capitalist mode of production are already manifest in the fact that the development of the forces of production and the production of wealth are subordinate to the valorization of value, and this narrow goal unleashes a glut of destructive forces against humanity and nature. Whether the expression of value in terms of capitalists and accountants, whether the expression of value in terms of capitalists and accountants rises or falls, it does not alter the fundamentally blinkered character of the capitalist mode of production.